Thank you to Malaprops for having me and for everything that you do here for the community and for joining us with readers. Authors love the opportunity to get in front of readers at every moment that we can. Hi to all of you out there in virtual land. And like the intro, like she said, just feel free to pop in the questions whenever you feel like it. I thought what I would do to begin with, one of the questions that I get asked a lot, and I'll try to do a Reader's Digest condensed version of this, and that is to tell you a little bit about how I became a writer. So I'm not one of these types of authors that started when I was like this high. I kind of wish that I was. I have a little bit of an envy for those individuals that knew that's what they wanted to do from a very young age. And that wasn't something that I knew that I wanted to do. But I did read a lot. And I think that my mom, who was a reader also, saw that in me at an early age and started taking me to the library, going up to the drugstore and buying books, you know, whenever she could, or going over here and buying books. So my love of reading is, I think, really sort of the foundation for how I became a writer. But I'm a late bloomer in a lot of things. And so I was definitely a late bloomer. Before I began my writing career, I worked in IT for about 35 years. Did a lot of different roles with IT, and anybody who has done any IT work knows how stressful that can be. And it's just something that can suck away the hours of your life, it seems like. So I was basically a cubicle rat, I guess you could say. I worked for a company called International Telephone and Telegraph, which was ITT, for about 9 years. And then I worked for another company called Northern Telecom, which eventually became Nortel, for about 25 years. And somewhere in there, for about a year, I sold key systems, which I absolutely despised and hated. I was not cut out for cold calling sales, hated it. But somewhere along the way, I had made a declaration back when I was about 18 years old. And I said, I want to become a writer. And then I didn't do anything for like 30 years. I had this manuscript sitting on one of my work laptops that was about 85 pages long. And I would pull it out once a year, I think, and try to do something with it. And then I would put it away and I wouldn't touch it for like 3 years. And so then my company went bankrupt. And I literally believe that that was sort of the virtual push off the edge of the cliff that I needed. That was in 2008. And I told my husband, if I'm ever going to do anything about the writing, now is the time. But first I went back to school and got my degree in business management, Bachelor of Science in Business Management, which is absolutely doing me no good right now whatsoever. And I took out that little manuscript that I'd been dabbling with for all those years, decades really, and I began to try to work on it. So, but I was still working with the company as they sold down the business, and I ended up working first. That came first, the 40 hours, 50 hours a week, whatever, and then school was second. And then finally, if I had any gas left in the tank, I worked on that manuscript. So that was from about 2008 through about 2011, looked for a freelance editor. And interestingly enough, that manuscript that I had actually probably started on back in like 1990, after I read Ellen Foster by Kay Gibbons. That was kind of the clinch pin that said, this is what I want to write. If I ever write at all, this is the kind of book I want to write. And I found a freelance editor and I ended up working with them for about a year. And that 85-page manuscript, which grew to 250 pages and then 300 pages or so, became The Education of Dixie Dupree, believe it or not. The first and one and only thing I ever wrote. And so that is a very, very condensed Reader's Digest version of how I became a writer. And I haven't looked back since. And the thing that was a little bit of serendipity, I guess you could say, for how I got an agent was that freelance editor that I worked with had connections in New York. And the way her freelance model worked is if she felt like if your manuscript had a chance, then she would submit on your behalf like an exclusive submission. And so the first two agents rejected it, but the third agent, which is John Talbot, picked it up. And I've been with him now almost 12 years. And of course, the book didn't sell right away, which was not good news. That was like from 2012 to 2015. And 2015 is when it finally sold. But the serendipity to all of that was I left Nortel. My end date was March 30th of 2012. And I signed with him March 9th of 2012, literally 3 weeks before. So I was very sad, because I'd been with the company for 25 years and it was like leaving family. But yet, on the other hand, I had this new thing to look forward to. So that's a little bit of the background of how I became a writer. What I wanted to do quickly also is to talk a little bit about some of the historic facts that are all woven into this book here, When the Jessamine Grows, which is my 6th novel. And I've got a little story too about how I ended up writing about the Civil War. It was definitely not something that I wanted to write about, but my husband, as I was working through other books, like my 4th book, which is The Moonshiner's Daughter, while I was struggling with that and trying to figure out whether I wanted to write about that or not, he's like, I don't know why you don't write about the Civil War. Doesn't your byline say that you write about troubled times? And so it's sort of morphed into writing vivid fiction about the American South. But it used to be that I wrote of family hardship and troubled times in a bygone South. And so I don't know of any, more troubled time than the Civil War. So that was, then I said, no, I'm going to write about the moon shining in Wilkes County, North Carolina. And so that happened. And then the next problem comes up about, what are you going to write for the 5th book? And there he is again. You should write about the Civil War. And no, I don't want to write about the Civil War. And I ended up writing about the turpentine labor camps set during the Depression era, which is the Saints of Swallow Hill. And I loved writing that book because that was the origin story for how we became the Tar Heel State, known as the Tar Heel State. So finally, then I'm once again searching for the idea for the 6th book. And there's my husband in the background. Civil War? And so, yes, finally, I gave in. And this is a book that's set during the Civil War. But what I want to say about that, I feel like it is uniquely different from any other Civil War story. And there's 2 reasons for this. Number one, my characters, Joetta McBride and her husband, Ennis, live in Nash County, North Carolina. They are subsistence farmers or yeoman farmers. Are you all familiar with what that is? And for those of you that may not know what that is where you grow your own food to feed yourself and your livestock. So these individuals, I created these characters that were yeoman farmers, which interestingly enough made up 65% of the population of North Carolina during this time frame. So that's one unique thing about it. They did not own slaves and they were neutral. So they didn't want anything to do with the war. They took on this stance of neutrality because of their lifestyle. It's like, what has this got to do with us? Then the other part about this book that makes it uniquely different is it's not about the war. So instead, I'm writing about people who are left behind. People like Joetta McBride, who are required to keep the farm running, keep food on the table, and keep their families together. And there's a quote that perfectly in my opinion, describes what the book is about. And it's by an American Iraqi activist, and her last name is Salbi. She's a podcaster and a writer. And she says, if we are to understand war, then we need to understand not only what happens on the front lines, but what happens on the back lines as well, where women are in charge of keeping the family going. And that is the essence of what this book is about. So Nash County, North Carolina sits kind of close up to the border of Virginia. And I picked that location for that reason. So they live in this area that, again, vastly rural, and it's near a couple of creeks, Fishing Creek and Swift Creek. But they're not, I didn't want to set them too close to the eastern side of the state, because that's where a good chunk of the fighting took place in the state of North Carolina. It was kind of along those waterways. And the other thing too, I've got my little notes down here to keep myself on track. The other thing too that I thought about when it comes to the neutrality stance is the fact that there were border states. So these border states consisted of, there was about 5 of them: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, I think, Missouri. And then actually after 1863, West Virginia was formed. And this was interesting to me because Virginia and North Carolina, and maybe another state or two, I'm not sure, but it maybe Kentucky, it was the western sides of those states that were always pro-Union, whereas the rest of them were for the Confederacy. And so that was interesting to me because I thought about the whole point of neutrality. If you're a border state, you're not taking sides. Most of those states, all except one, they bordered what they called the free states, which was the Union side. And then there was the one state that bordered down in the Confederacy. And I honestly don't remember which one that is. But either way, a border state just meant that they were sort of sitting back and not taking a side yet. And I began to think of individuals that might have taken that same stance. If you think about the fact that North Carolina had 65% who were yeoman farmers or subsistence farmers, it's like, what has that fight got to do with them? That literally meant that they did not own slaves. The other statistic that I thought was really interesting is that out of the entire state of North Carolina, with the population that we had at that time, 1/3 had enslaved people. So that was interesting, yet only 3% of that amount of people had the actual plantations, the big, and so they were considered the upper class. They were the gentry or the planters. That meant they were like doctors or lawyers. They lived on these plantations, had vast amounts of land, and they had the enslaved people doing the work. And then you had the middle class, and they would have been tradespeople, not skilled laborers, that was yeoman side, trade people, merchants, people like that. They might have had something like 20 slaves or less, and they made up about 20, I'm trying to get my numbers right, 65% yeomen, so about 30 to 35% were this middle class, and then the 3% that were of the plantation size. So that's how the breakdown of that third of the population who owned enslaved people, that was just fascinating to me, because again, it sort of goes back to that idea of it was a rich man's war. So those are, to me, just things that I learned while I was writing the story. So now I think what I want to do, I've got a couple of areas here that I'm going to read, but first I want to talk about what the story is in of itself. So like I mentioned, we have Joetta McBride and her husband Ennis, and they have 2 sons named Henry and Robert. Henry is 15 years old and Robert is 11. And then they have Rudine McBride, who is Joetta's father-in-law. This is Ennis's father. They are actually living on his land. And so when Ennis and Joetta first married, they built a house on the land, and it's beside the cabin where Ennis grew up, and that's where Mr. McBride lives now. Let's call Mr. McBride the squeaky wheel in the family, because he is truly the one that is, he's completely different from Ennis and Joetta in that he is a staunch Confederate. And so just before the war is about to break out is when the story begins. It's 1861, early 1861. And he is becoming more and more enthralled with this concept that there's going to be a war, because he doesn't trust Lincoln, who has just come into office. So while the book is not about the war, there is historic facts scattered throughout the story about the war. So he doesn't trust Lincoln, because Lincoln was to hold resolute to his promise that he would not interfere with the enslaved people. And what that had to do with was all of the territories out west. And this was part of this yet to happen westward expansion. So there were all of these territories, and there were some people who were going over there, and they were starting to try to expand in that direction and develop it. This was before the United States government, I believe, had started giving away vast amounts of land over there, as if they had the right, to do that. But there you go. So Lincoln, the big question with this particular area had to do with if an enslaved person escaped over there, would they be brought back or not? And he was supposed to stay out of that. So Mr. McBride was going on and on about, anyway, everything and anything to do with Lincoln and his positions. And Mr. McBride, of course, maybe like a lot of those individuals back then, he just thought Lincoln was going to meddle in it and interfere, and everything was just going to be ruined. And it was kind of crazy the way he thought, because he didn't own anything but the 100 acres that they were farming as yeoman farmers, but this was his dream, because he was constantly he was influencing Henry, the 15-year-old, who was a lot like any 15-year-old that we have nowadays. He was beginning to think for himself, and he was listening to his grandfather, and he was becoming enthralled with what his grandfather was saying. As Joetta was beginning to see this spark in his eye about, oh, this is sounding interesting. And Mr. McBride's position is, yes, if you want to make anything of yourself, you have two options, because this is not the life for you, meaning what his parents are doing, which would infuriate Joetta. And he said, you can either own vast amounts of land and a lot of slaves and have them do the work, like the Pools who live over here. An example, he was envious of Mr. Poole and his lifestyle. Or you can be a soldier. And that made Joetta mad, because he made it sound like it was a glorified thing. Like he didn't talk about the hardships of war and the fact that men were not invincible, that the ultimate price was death. And so this influences Henry. After several of these conversations taking place over the course of time, Henry begins to change a little bit. And the inciting incident in the book is and this is all on the back flap, so I am keeping this spoiler free for those of you who have not read it, but there is an inciting incident that takes place dealing with a little historic artifact that's called a cockade. Is anybody familiar with what the cockade is? Cockade is just a little symbol that people were wearing, almost like a little rosette. It was made out of material. Women were making these, and men and women would both wear them. And it was to show their support of secession. So the boys go to the store one day and come home, and Joetta had allowed that if they had any money left over from running the errand that they were doing, that they could get some candy. And she notices that Henry's hand is clenched and he has gotten a cockade. And this sets off a chain of events that will result in Henry running off. And again, this is on the back flap. So this is spoiler free again. And Joetta wants Ennis to go after him immediately. And Ennis refuses and says, no, he needs to learn the repercussions of his own actions. And besides, he's too young, so they'll send him home after 10 days. Well, the 10th day comes and Henry is not home. So Ennis is then compelled to go after him. But he realizes that unless he signs up, he can't get into the encampment to try to find him. If he's just out there on the periphery, what can he do? And so whether they wanted to or not, they are inadvertently drug into it. And I'm not going to say anything else about the story, but this is where it really, really takes off and begins. I mean, I think it's compelling from page 1, obviously. And actually, speaking of that, that's part of what I'm going to read to you all. But first, I want to read these little epigraphs that I put up front here. Place marker in. So I used, for some of my research, I used Mary Boykin Chestnut's Diary of the Civil War, which was absolutely fascinating. And then there's another lady, and I did not use any of her letters or anything, but her name is Lucy Buck. But anyway, these are at the beginning of the book. We shall never, any of us, be the same as we have been. And that's Lucy Buck, American diarist, Front Royal, Virginia. The second one is, for even the small piece of bread and the molasses were things of the past. My larder was empty. Mary Boykin Chestnut, March 6th, 1865. Okay. Chapter 1, somewhere near Whitaker's, Nash County, North Carolina, 1861. Joetta McBride could not stomach conflict. What was transpiring in the country was certainly troubling. However, the growing discord within her own family was most concerning to her. Like her evening primrose, it had bloomed swiftly overnight, and what had been merely a nuisance grew into a matter of significance. Her father-in-law, Rudine McBride, was who she blamed. The topic occupying Mr. McBride's mind of late was war. He spent a good deal of time nattering on about the shoddy job Lincoln was doing now that he had been voted in. Lincoln was to hold resolute to his word and not interfere with the institution of slavery. Despite this, he was distrusted by many, including Mr. McBride. These issues would only have been a distraction to Joetta, except for the effect it had on 15-year-old Henry. To her dismay, Mr. McBride reveled in the details of Northern and Southern dispositions, while Henry's questions began to fixate with uncanny interest on the possibilities of a war. Only the other day, a sunbeam cast light across her eldest son's face, highlighting the dark hair sprouting on his upper lip and along his jawline. He was becoming a young man, and with that, Joetta supposed, came a desire to think for himself. Henry was not the only one Mr. McBride captivated with his talk. 11-year-old Robert paid attention too, although Henry was the one who plied his grandfather with questions. Mr. McBride, enthused by his rapt audience, went on about heroic deeds and a soldier's bravery, describing how they ran full tilt toward their adversary and engaged in mortal battle in the name of honor. What he never brought up was no matter how virtuous he made it, winning should never be assumed. Men were not invincible. War was anything but how he depicted it, with his elaborations on the cause and seeking justice, the grandeur of a righteous struggle. He left out the misery of exposure to extreme temperatures, hunger, thirst, disease, horrific injuries, and the ultimate price, death. He treated it like some fanciful fairy tale life. Mr. McBride expounded on the chance to see new places, meet new people, as if war were a social event. Henry's eyes glowed, his imagination ignited by what could be discovered beyond this patch of land where he had grown up. This troubled her immensely. They were yeoman farmers. They raised pigs and chickens, owned a beautiful golden milk cow named Honey, and a cooperative plow mule named Pal. They sold white corn and sorghum in order to purchase sugar, flour, salt, and coffee. They wanted for nothing, and they owed no one. Okay, I'm going to read a second part here. Okay, early. Over the course of a few days, Henry distanced himself even more once he started talking to the volunteers. To Joetta, it was as if he was participating in his own secession, one from his family. Robert spent every night out in the barn with him. She was glad the boys were close, as there was hardly a day they had not been side by side since they were born. The divide within the country grew. Joetta became sad for these men and their intentions, sad and anxious. Any chance of reconciliation was unlikely, given the no concessions, no backing down nature so obvious in the swagger of their walk, the confidence in their mission, and such pugnacious attitudes on display. The constant flow of men coming by the house was not unlike Fishing Creek, breaching the embankment after a heavy rain. Like a coming flood, if war swept over the land, it would leave desolation in its wake. These were her innermost thoughts, ones she dared not speak about, for saying it might make it true. A week after the trouble with Henry, the family gathered at the breakfast table in the early morning. Everyone except, of course, Henry. Ennis sat at the head of the table, and once everyone was seated, he spoke. Robert, go get your brother. It's time to put a stop to this foolishness. To Joetta, he said, no more sending food out to him. If he wants to eat, he will have to come to the table. Mr. McBride interjected, you can't be letting the boy go hungry. He's got to work. No one is letting him go hungry. He can come to the table and eat what he wants. Robert did not do as he was asked. His eyes remained riveted on his lap, his hands knotted together. A tear fell off his nose. Deep within Joetta came a familiar fear, like when she had started to bleed too early and her stomach would cramp. And she knew. Her voice held a trace of alarm. Robert? She spoke his name with a knowledge of what he did not want to admit, already sinking her heart, even as the words left his mouth. He left. Okay, I am open for any questions that anyone may have for me online, here in the store.
We'll start with the folks who were here, if you have anything, and if not, we'll go to the online audience.
How, I guess this is a writer's question, right? How do the people that you write about, how do they come to you?
And Donna, can you repeat the question so
Yes.
folks at home can hear? Thank you.
So the question is a writer question, which I love, and that is, how do the people that I write about come to me? They come usually by name, and I have to know their name first and foremost. I cannot write about anything I can write a scene, like scenery describing flowers and trees maybe. But when it comes down to actually getting into the characters, I have to know their name. And I won't start until I do. And that has actually really slowed me up sometimes, because a good example is I usually don't have trouble with names. Like Joetta McBride was perfect for this story. Actually, just a little insider scoop here for those of you out there too. When the Jessamine Grows is not the original title. The original title is The Rebellion of Joetta McBride. And I actually snuck a little tidbit in there that holds on to that. But I won't say what it is or how it appears or why it appears, but that's in the book still. I saved it in that little secret spot. But once, you know, I had her name, I knew who she was. I already more or less knew. Now, I don't have that ease with every character. In my current work in progress, to give you that perfect example, I'm writing that from 3 different perspectives. And one of the characters, I have changed her name 3 times. And I have finally landed on it, and I'm keeping it, and it is what it is. I'm not, and it's perfect. But I had trouble getting her on the page until I knew her name. So, writer weirdness. Yes.
So do Joetta and Ennis ever get beyond being neutral about the Civil War? Do they ever take a position on the institution of slavery and that, you know, being in support of it is being on the wrong side of history in retrospect?
Right. That's a great question. So one thing that I can say about Joetta and Ennis is they are sympathetic towards the enslaved people. It's not that they condoned it. Their biggest thing with the whole neutrality was about, what has it got to do with us? I mean, seriously, if you think about how vastly, I've said this already, that vastly rural North Carolina was, 85% of the state was rural farmland. And there were great distances between these farms. And when you are on a, almost, you know, speaking of isolationist view, which is what you could say that they might have had, but you are isolated. And it's like the big doings of the world aren't, you know, really affecting you until you can't get flour and sugar and coffee and the things that they eventually could not get. And so as far as them changing, they never changed. And this is part of this story that became so big with Joetta. This is actually what ended up creating a situation for her that was very, very precarious. And it became very challenging to write her side of this story, because most of the time, I think people will almost fold like a lawn chair, you know, to take sides, because it's the safest thing to do, because then you're either here or you're there. But to walk that middle line and stick to it is very complicated, especially in that time frame, because what ended up happening with her and the challenges that were brought forward by Ennis leaving her behind, she decided, I'm going to stick to my convictions. And she does this, and she becomes a pariah in the community, and things get really, really tough. Anybody who has read any of my work out there in the virtual audience, or, you know, I don't know that anybody here has, but I don't write soft stories. The stories are gritty, they're tough, and this is no different. It's like somebody said online, this is no Gone with the Wind, Southern Belle kind of story at all. It is a true depiction of what could have happened, and probably, and I know did happen to some of these individuals who were left to run these farms, mostly women and their children. And it was hard, very hard. But they, you know, she had to kind of manipulate her words and maneuver and be smart, because in reality, I could have had her thrown into prison, and that would have changed my story drastically. But I felt like that was too common a thing that would have, I like to write things that are from a different angle and a different perspective. And I wanted to keep her on that farm, and I wanted her to stay strong, you know, with what she was intending to do, with her beliefs. And so that was hard to do, to write her in such a way that she was savvy enough to stay out of the fray, like not be in prison. She was definitely in the fray from, you know, people doing things that, you know, to teach her a lesson. But yeah, so she stuck to her guns.
And the people teaching her, trying to teach her a lesson, were people who were sympathetic to the Confederacy.
That's right.
In North Carolina.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. And the other thing too that I felt like sort of made this a realistic way to have her stick to her guns, so to speak, again. These were her friends. And so they were concerned about her, but they also were fearful for what might happen to them. Because if they saw what happened to her, then it's like, you know, so they were distancing themselves, and it's just, it was just a really bad situation. And then the other thing was, you know, she could have ended up at the end of a rope. They could have killed her. And then my story would have been done at 150 pages instead of 370. So it was just a very complicated thing to write, you know, to keep her realistic, because I don't want to take too much of that, you know, creative license. I wanted to give it a very honest and true depiction of what could have happened to an individual that felt this way and decided to stick to it, no matter how hard it became for her.
So another question, well, it's a two-part question, actually. What is your favorite part of the writing process is the first part. And then the other is, how much time did you spend on research?
Those are good questions. Okay, can you ask that first part again?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about my research.
Yeah, what's your favorite part of the writing process? Writing
the end. No, I think I always, the hardest part for me is the beginning. And that's because it's, I mean, you know, the proverbial blank page, there it is, the blinking cursor. And you know, you start typing and then you take it out. So that part I don't care for too much. What I do like is once I understand who the characters are, and again, it goes back to naming them and beginning to put their story together. And quite honestly, that's a great question, because the research is what helps me create them. It helps me create the scenes. It helps me figure out how events are going to take place with them. So I research throughout the entire book. Now I might spend 2 to 3 months before I even begin writing. And then once I start writing, I end up researching throughout the entire book. And that's only because I will run into something that it's like, oh gosh, I don't know about this. And you have to go look it up. So the research starts 2 to 3 months ahead. And if it takes me anywhere from, say, 15 months to 18 months to write a book, I mean, I'm, you know, peeling through whatever materials I can find for anywhere from 18 to 20 months time frame. Thank you for that question.
Oh, ask here if there's any more questions, because we do have another question online as well, but want to give you all a chance if you have any more. No pressure.
Joetta, the Jasmine. So Joetta is
the Jessamine.
Jasmine.
Yes. So this is interesting.
Can you repeat that?
Yes.
Because these folks are not yelling the way I am for that. For the actual audience. Yeah.
No, you have to give.
That's okay. No. Yeah. Well, actually, so this was a question about the Jessamine flower. So what is interesting about that is the Jessamine is the perfect metaphor for Joetta, because the plant itself is hardy and tolerant. But the other thing about the jessamine is a lot of people think that that comes from the family of jasmine. And it isn't, because jasmine, you can make tea, but the jessamine is poisonous. And a lot of people don't realize it's even toxic to bees. So for instance, if a bee gets too much of the nectar, it can be harmful to bees. And I think this is where Mother Nature is brilliant, because the jessamine typically doesn't bloom until mid-February to early March, before the bees are out. And also the other thing is the individuals who work in the industry to create perfume, they have been unable to replicate this scent. And so it's a very fascinating, it's also known as the trumpet horn, I think. Back in the early 1700s, there was an explorer or something that called it the yellow jessamine. It's just, and I don't even know how. I do know sort of how I came upon jessamine. I've got this little 2-page thing that I printed out that deals with the natural flora and fauna of this area of North Carolina, the Piedmont area, and kind of to the East Coast, so that I never misrepresent and have something like, you know, a plant or a tree or a flower, bush, whatever, shrub in the wrong spot. You know, I don't want to do that. So I'm kind of picky about that kind of stuff.
Can I ask?
Oh, yeah, please,
To follow up that, how come you changed the name to what you originally had? Because that was a lovely name. How did you come to this one?
The publisher.
Okay.
Yeah. They wanted something as melodic as The Saints of Swallow Hill. And to be honest with you, I love this title.
Okay.
I actually like it better than my own, even though I'll always be a little partial to it, because I mean, I worked with that title for like 18 months and then I had to change it. That's like, you know, you've had your child for 18 months and then you have to change his, you know, his name, his or her name. And so it was originally from them, it was Where the Jessamine Grows. And then I was like, where the red fern grows, where the crawdads sing, you know. And so I didn't want to be on anybody's coattails. And so they gave me about a couple of days to see if I could come up with a different, you know, way, but something about the Jessamine Grows needed to be part of it. And literally this was one of those times that you think about, you know, that you hear about or whatever, middle of the night, you pop awake, when the Jessamine Grows. And it was perfect for a particular scene in the book.
Folks need to read the book to.
Yes, you have to read the book to find out all these little hints that I'm dropping off here about this, that, the other, that you got to find out about. You just have to.
So our other question is about what's next. If you can tell us anything about the book you're working on now.
Oh boy. Okay. So I have been asked this question a lot, and I'm not talking about this book very much because it is a story that is, once again, I absolutely love finding these little nuggets of historic events. And that's more or less what has happened with this next book that I'm working on. So I'm under contract for book 7. So it's due August of this year. The manuscript is due then. And what I will say about this next project is I feel like it's going to absolutely blow everybody's mind, because I couldn't believe it when I started digging into it. And I stumbled across it, just like I stumbled across naval stores. And what the heck is that? And then I realized what they were. North Carolina top producer from 1700s up to the late 1800s. And that was where the whole turpentine industry came in. And then I set the story in the Depression. This is the Saints of Swallow Hill. Once again, I have stumbled across a historic event, but it's not just in the South. Like the Saints of Swallow Hill dealt with nothing but that big swath of states down through the South, all the way over into Texas that has the longleaf pine. So that industry was, you know, kept right in this area, Southeast. But this actually happened across the US. And it deals with women strictly or mostly. I mean, men are kind of in this too, but it deals with, I'll just say this, if you were of the era where you burned your bra back in the 60s or whatever, you're going to probably want to burn your bra. Well, not you, but you probably want to burn your bra again. You know, it's probably going to upset some people when I bring forward the history of what was taking place. It's stunning. And some of the laws are still on the books today. I'll say that. Yep, holding it close to my chest. Can't talk about it yet in detail, just can't.
Well, thank you for that teaser, and thank you for talking with us this evening. I think that's a good note to wrap up on. If you have any final thoughts before we leave and say goodnight to the virtual audience.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you out there in virtual land. I hope that I have given you enough information about when the Jessamine grows to entice you to just have your little fingers travel right over to the Malaprop's site and go ahead and get the book. For those of you that are listening virtually that are local to the Malaprop store, they're going to have me sign copies, so you can still get a signed copy. And those of you that aren't local, they're going to be signed copies, and I'm sure they're happy to ship them to you. So thank you all for joining in virtually, and thank you all for being here as well.
Thank you.